We are training the next generation to meet the strategic challenges of tomorrow. We are dedicated to understanding in order to act better.
Welcome to this second day of the conference on Is War Over Taiwan Coming? I am Jean-Baptiste. I am Professor of Political Science at the University of Quebec, Montreal, and co-director of the Network for Strategic Analysis, which is organizing this event, sponsored by Canada's Department of National Defence, whom I thank for allowing this event to take place. Yesterday focused on the possible inevitability of a war over Taiwan and the perspectives of regional allies and partners. And today we'll continue this fabulous, really, discussion we had yesterday, looking into the perspectives of some NATO allies, and also touching on a question we did discuss yesterday as well: what lessons we can learn from the war in Ukraine, and are we drawing the wrong lessons, as the question I asked yesterday? I may ask our panelists today as well. And this will be followed after lunch by a panel with our graduate students who will present the work they're doing at their master degree level with us today. That second panel this afternoon will be held in French, but the one this morning will be held in English. This panel, entitled "What Lessons Are Allies Drawing from Ukraine for Taiwan?" is chaired by Jonathan Paquin, who is a professor of political science at the University Laval, and also research lead on the research axis of the Network for Strategic Analysis on Great Power Competition. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for chairing this panel. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Justin. Is the mic working? Yeah. So good morning, everyone. It's a great honor to chair this fourth panel of this great conference that started yesterday. I think everything has been said about our main topic of discussion for this morning's discussion. So I will, right now, I will start with presenting our different panelists. I will be briefly presenting each of them. And of course, you can read their full biography in the program. And I suggest that you do so because they have a pretty impressive background. So starting with Gaëlle Rivard-Piché on my left. Gaëlle is a strategic analyst with Defense Research and Development Canada, where she works closely with the Canadian Armed Forces, providing direct decision-making support through evidence-based research on a wide range of topics. She is currently a fellow at the Norman Peterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University in Ottawa. Then we have Jean-Baptiste Jeangène Vilmer, who is the director of the Institute for Strategic Research, IRSEM, at the French Ministry of the Armed Forces, after having served as policy officer on strategic and global affairs at the policy planning staff of the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has published extensively on military interventions, on the law of armed conflicts, and on hybrid warfare, among other subjects. Then we have Tereza Novotna. Tereza Novotna is a Korea Europe Center Fellow at Free University Berlin and Korea Associate at 9-Line. She has widely published on EU foreign policy. She previously held a Korea Foundation and Marie Sklodowska-Curie research projects on the EU's foreign policy towards North Korea. And then last but not least, Charles-Philippe David is full professor of political science, president of the Center for United States Studies, as well as the founder of the Raoul Dandurand Chair of Strategic and Diplomatic Studies at the University of Quebec at Montreal. He has published extensively on American foreign policy, on international security, among other topics. So you have 15 minutes each for your presentations, and then we will have a Q&A period right after that. Gaëlle, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. First of all, thank you to Justin for the invitation and the Réseau d'Analyse Stratégique, as well as their fantastic team of students that helped organizing the event. So I'm a strategic analyst with as a Defense Research and Development Canada. And for those of you who are not familiar with the organization, it is actually the research branch of the Department of National Defense. And so I'm kind of a hybrid of an academic or scholar embedded with the military. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today are, I'm actually going to do something that I usually don't like people doing, but I'm not going to answer all the questions. I'm going to focus on specific questions that are related to the work that I'm doing. And one of the reasons for that, if you've read my bio, is that I'm far from an expert in the Indo-Pacific. I'm actually, I originally worked on Latin America, and working with the RDC, I became kind of a jack of all trades, but I've looked at China in the context of Canadian national security and national defense, as well as in the Arctic. And I want to look at Ukraine and see what Ukraine means actually for China, and ultimately how can Canada position itself. So my discussion is going to be a bit more, I would say, stratospheric, but I hope that I'm going to propose some ideas, and I would love to hear my co-panelists on them, because I really look forward to hearing what you have to say as well. So as I said, my view don't represent the RDC, the Department of National Defense, Canadian Armed Forces, the Government of Canada, but here I am. So I think it's very interesting to think about what the war in Ukraine means for China, because I think it's changing over time, but overall, since the war started, China really found itself between a rock and a hard place after the war outbreak. And as we're looking at the war now, it's getting limited, but it is likely to be protracted and extremely brutal, as was actually pointed out yesterday by the NATO Secretary General. And I do think that at this point that we can expect that Russia will come out of this war significantly diminished in a way where it's not going to be able to actually project force and influence globally the way it was doing prior to the war, which means that it's going to create a vacuum internationally. And I also think that the war is actually a catalyst from some of the larger strategic trends that we've been looking at, and it's accelerating some of the processes that are taking place in the international system at the moment. And it's interesting to look at how China is actually going to navigate these geopolitical shifts, because as John pointed out yesterday, China is playing the entire field, right? And I think this is a great opportunity for us to learn how they are going about this kind of strategy, the tactics that they're using, as well, how they're refining their approach to different issues in different regions at the same time. And ultimately, I'm going to discuss a little bit the Canadian perspective, because I do think it's been announced that there's going to be a review of global affairs or Department of Foreign Affairs, as well as a review of the defense policy. And I think we're really at a point of inflection for national defense and foreign policy in this country. And at a very important time, it's going to be interesting to see how Canada actually positioned itself after, I would say, like 80 years pretty much of continuity. So as I said, as the war started in Ukraine, China really found itself between a rock and a hard place. And it was really interesting to see the general reactions of commentators. And I feel that we always go, when there's a crisis, we go, black or white. And so you have some commentators that were like, oh yeah, Russia-Ukraine war is foreshadowing China's invasion of Taiwan. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you had other analysts that were suggesting that actually that could be enabling cooperation between Washington and Beijing to broker a peace deal. And I think that these two extremes actually did not happen, because as in most cases, in most crises, most situations, we live in the gray. We live in between, in situations where everybody is very uncomfortable. And when it comes to China, they were, I think, one of the main sources of this discomfort was really the relationship with Russia versus the relationship with Ukraine. China's ambassador to the US had made clear that there is no forbidden zone of cooperation between China and Russia. He made that statement several times to the Americans as well as to the public. And China has a very clear stand on the fact that they're blaming US and NATO for the war. And it is, I think it's it is acutely aware of the economic and strategic cost that's associated to being closely linked to Russia. So they're really at this point now where they're managing risk. And then at the same time, Kiev joined the Belt and Road Initiative in 2017. Chinese conglomerates were investing massively in the development of port infrastructure for commodity exports, and as well as in the defense sector of Ukraine and the green energy, among others. And even I think it was in 2020, even President Zelensky pointed out that he was really hoping that Ukraine would become that bridge for China into Europe. And so the war really threw a wrench into China's strategy towards Europe. As the war continues, though, and if you look at the media, I think we're really refocusing towards a conversation around strategic competition that's walking away from Ukraine. Ukraine now is almost treated, with some exception, like discussions around sanctions, but generally, and especially in North American media, is really treated as a tactical and operational issue. We're talking about progress, we're talking about how limited it is, but generally speaking, if you look at like the comments and the analysis that's made, it's really pivoting towards the Indo-Pacific, and it really shows where our head is at in terms of long-term implications. And I do think that the international system has reached right now a new equilibrium that's probably very temporary, but power is more diffuse and it's also more competitive. I think the war has given China the opportunity to observe, as I said, very closely the behavior of the US and its allies. And I would say that we responded above and beyond what they were expecting from behavior we'd shown before. The strength of the Western response has surprised. There's a perception that the US and NATO and the allies were quite weak, but the fact that we were able to stand up, to present a united front, and to actually, even for Europe, to be able to agree over sanction is really showing that I would say the West is not dead. And on top of that, the fact that we've demonstrated that we're willing to escalate, I think is sending a clear message for Taiwan. And this is a message that we will have to be able to continue to deliver over time to make sure that it doesn't look only like, that we don't look only like a straw man. However, I'm not particularly optimistic when it comes to the durability of the Western unity. I do think that we're in a very difficult climate for political parties at the domestic level, because in democracies we're combining the effect of the economic crisis, the lingering effects of the pandemic, combined with the effect of the war and financial markets. So all of that combined, I think, is going to lead probably in the next couple of years to the rise of more populist parties, and probably the elections of governments that are not necessarily willing to support an international response or a front against Russia or even China, especially, and that will prefer to go around a rally around the flag effect at the domestic level on different issues. However, I also think that there's a lot, what we're seeing right now, there's a lot of, as I said, power is more diffuse, and that presents a clear opportunity for forum shopping for smaller states, including Canada. Some people were surprised by the fact that the country, like non-aligned countries or developing countries, did not denounce Russia right away. And I think this is showing, generally speaking, in the strategic geopolitical sphere, a lack of understanding of dynamics in the global South, and also in how the global South perceives the North, first of all. On top of that, also the fact that in the global South, there's been development and there's been a lot of South-South cooperation, the BRICS being one of the key example, but generally speaking, I think a lot of the countries are, edging their bet and not putting all their apple in the same basket. And a good example of that is actually the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that was just announced by Washington, that's really putting the emphasis on the fact that 12 countries are going to join this framework, but with some clear exceptions. Most of those countries were also part of the China-led Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. They're just playing both fields. And that totally makes sense, because if you're in an environment where power is diffuse enough, then you can actually be proactive and pursue your national interests. You can actually, I think this is a time where some countries are going to be able to make a lot of gains. But I think this applies also to Canada. But this is not an idea with which we're comfortable when we think about how we do partnerships, alliances, and so on. And there's going to be a need to be more proactive, I would say, and less reactive to this kind of issues. And then the war will end at some point. I'm not going to speculate on how it's going to end or what it's going to look like. But overall, I do believe that China is going to position itself in a way where it's going to be playing a key role, if it's not the main role, in the reconstruction of Ukraine. They were already present on the ground. They have clear interest in doing so. And it will also be a way to establish a critical presence close to Europe, and in the long term to pursue their strategic goal. And on top of that, I think, as I said, I alluded to earlier, a weakened Russia will create these influence vacuums in several regions of the world, and especially regions that we don't consider are important, including Latin America, for example, or Sub-Saharan Africa. Yet China is probably going to move in and push into those vacuums. But that means that in the next crisis, well, the Western coalition is going to be smaller and smaller. And I think we need to, in terms of developing partnership, this has to be a priority, and we need to rethink where we're engaging when we're talking about new partnership. Yes, the Indo-Pacific is important, but other regions are also going to play an important role. And so ultimately, when it comes to the implication for Canada, as I said, I think there's this fundamental need to shift from a reactive to a proactive posture, both in terms of foreign policy, and national defense. And I think Australia constitutes a very interesting example for Canada to follow, considering how in the last few years, the immediate security environment has changed, and the immediate neighborhood. And there's a need, I think, to really reassess nationally what is happening in our neighborhood. And I'm not only including the Arctic and the North American continent, but also the Caribbean and part of South America. When I talked about forum shopping, and I think when we talk about forum shopping, what is required first and foremost is a very clear understanding of our national interests and of our priorities. And I think this is where the review of the foreign policy and how we do foreign policy is going to be extremely important. And from a national defense and Canadian Armed Forces perspective, yesterday we talked a little bit about how like Australian military defense forces are kind of boutique force, right? They're really good for a first strike, for defense of like very clear limited targets. But if we're walking into a world where wars are protracted, where the intensity is higher, we need to have more depth in terms of our military capabilities. And that military capability also has to go beyond conventional forces. I do think that competition is going to continue to happen mostly below the threshold in the medium term, and that means that we need like very specific capabilities to actually prevent, deter, and counter some of those threats. And so at the end of the day, I think in the next 6 months, Canada is going to be asking itself, right, what should we prioritize, but also we should ask ourselves, where can we get the most bang for our buck? Where can we actually invest and then get high returns for our own national security and prosperity? So I'm going to stop here.
Thank you very much, Gaëlle. Jean-Baptiste? Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Justin, for the invitation. It's always great to be back in Montreal. So I have a PowerPoint. Could you please put it on the screen? Yeah. Yeah, voila, great. So I'll be addressing three questions. The first one is, why is France interested in this issue? The second, does the Ukraine war make a Chinese invasion of Taiwan more likely? And the third is the tricky question of how would France react? So the first one, why is France interested in this issue? So the PowerPoint is not working. Yes. Yeah, so you can see the map. It's better. Well, obviously, the first answer is that, as it has been mentioned yesterday, it's because France is indeed an Indo-Pacific nation. France has the second largest EEZ in the world of more than 10 million square kilometers, and actually 93% of it is in the Indo-Pacific. And there are also 2 million French citizens living in the area, so protecting its citizens and its sovereign territory is the first reason why France has an interest in the region. But there are other reasons, obviously, including trade.
Trade with the Indo-Pacific represents more than a third of French trade in goods outside of the EU, and it has grown up in the last 10 years by almost 50%. The Indo-Pac is economically important, not only to France, but to the EU, and especially to the South China Sea, through which 30% of trade between Asia and Europe transit. So that's why France, given this context, maintains an important diplomatic network, but also an important military presence in the region, with more than 7,000 French troops permanently posted there. So the French armed forces are regularly mobilized for mostly maritime surveillance operations, but also rescue operations for victims of natural disasters, for example. And for that, France is not acting alone. Obviously, they built partnerships with a few key countries, so India, Japan, and until recently, Australia. Yeah, I was going to mention that. So obviously, the AUKUS affair damaged quite substantially the bilateral relation, but the recent Australian election revives our hope to put the relationship back on track very soon. And it has been said recently in Paris. So since 2020, France is also, it has to be mentioned, a development partner for ASEAN. So in this context, the French strategy in the Indo-Pacific seeks to maintain an area that is open and inclusive, free of all forms of coercion and founded on multilateralism and the respect of international law. And of course, by doing that, they find China on its road. That's where Chinese increasing power and territorial claims are a challenge, because Beijing does violate freedom of navigation, exerts all kinds of coercion in the region, and also violates international law. And the French Navy Chief of Staff publicly acknowledged that the Chinese pressure was increasing in the region, including against French interests, when he said, I quote, "Our boats are systematically followed, sometimes forced to maneuver in front of Chinese ships to avoid a collision in defiance of the rules of freedom of navigation that we defend. Some of our stopovers in countries in the region where we used to pass through are cancelled at the last moment without clear explanation." So what is implicated here is that it's been done under Chinese pressure on local government. End of quote. So in such a context, the French Indo-Pacific strategy has 4 pillars. One is security and defense, 2, economic connectivity, research, innovation, 3, multilateralism and the rule of law, 4, climate change, biodiversity, and sustainable management of oceans. And if you take the first one, which is of interest to us, on security and defense, it involves concretely the protection of French interests, but also developing military cooperation with local governments, maintaining strategic stability, and preserving freedom of navigation, as I said. Now, the second reason why France is interested in the issue we are discussing today is that not only it is an Indo-Pacific nation, but it also has a good relationship with Taiwan. And first, it should be reminded why Taiwan is an important actor per se. It's the 6th largest economy in Asia. It's a world leader in the semiconductor industry. It's spending more than 3%, almost 4% of its GDP on research and development, and therefore it is ranked 3rd in the world after Israel and South Korea in that respect. And Taiwan is also a model for the functioning of a young democratic society in Asia today, particularly among territories with a Confucian culture. And obviously, Taiwan is strategically important because tensions in the Taiwan Strait could affect regional and potentially global stability, as we are discussing today. So for many reasons, Taiwan is an important actor. Now, France does acknowledge the One China policy, but it does not mean, as it has been said yesterday as well, that France agrees with it, or rather with China's interpretation of it. And this is where there is some room for maneuver, allowing France, for example, to support Taiwan's request to participate in the specialized UN agencies and other IO's international organizations, and to maintain close relations with Taiwan. For example, bilateral trade, 5.6 billion euros, and with the cross-strait relations deteriorating and more Taiwanese companies leaving the Chinese markets, there is actually potential for French companies to grow in Taiwan, especially in the post-Brexit context. There's also a strong cooperation in the fields of innovation, technology, aeronautics, cultural, scientific exchanges. We also obviously share democratic values and I would say similar vision on security issues, such as freedom of navigation, cyber issues, and hybrid threats. And as an illustration, I personally spent some time in Taiwan in the last years to work with the local authorities, but also civil society on what we call in France information manipulation. So the issue of disinformation, but also influence operations, especially in the context of election interference. And last time I was there was in January 2020 for their last general election. And in the 90s, it has to be mentioned as well that France also signed 2 major military equipment contracts with Taiwan for frigates and Mirage 2000, but it did not go well because irregularities were found in the contracts. So there were, as a result, significant tensions between Taiwan and France, with actually an interruption of all contact between Ministry of Defense until the end of 2010s. Another limit, I would say, of the bilateral relationship is the absence of official ministerial level visits to Taiwan since 1998. Unlike our British and German partners, they do have those visits, we don't. And that leaves the relation unbalanced since visits of Taiwanese ministers in France have been regular, but they always remain discreet. Self-censorship on the part of the French public, but also private decision makers is common. However, at the parliament level, the relation is quite dynamic, and despite regular threats from the Chinese embassy in Paris, French MPs and senators regularly visit Taiwan. Also, France is strongly attached to the freedom of navigation, as I said, and the French Navy transits the Taiwan Strait on average once a year. So now, question 2. Does the Ukraine war in that context make a Chinese invasion of Taiwan more likely? Personally, I don't think so, and the opposite, because actually Putin is not winning in Ukraine. His initial plan to take the whole country failed and is now focusing on a small part of it at a very high cost. And a couple of days after the beginning of the war, I published this paper on the website War on the Rocks, explaining why Putin already lost in Ukraine, and I believe this is still true today. So actually the example of Russia's failure to take Ukraine sends a strong signal to Beijing that failure is indeed possible. And they know in Beijing that such a failure would be unacceptable for the party and likely the end of Xi Jinping. Not only failure is possible, but I would say it's even more likely than Russia's failure in Ukraine was, because taking Taiwan for China is even harder for at least 2 reasons. And the first is geography, because on the one hand, Russia has territorial continuity with Ukraine without any natural obstacle invading Ukraine. There are rivers in Ukraine, but not on the relevant borders. And therefore, invading Ukraine was fast and easy because all they had to do was actually crossing a border on a flat terrain. While on the other hand, Taiwan is an island, and China would first have to cross a strait that is at least 130 kilometers large. And due to weather conditions, this could be done only at very specific times in the year, only a couple of weeks maybe. And the Taiwanese terrain is such that there are only a limited number of beaches on which Chinese forces could land. And of course, those places are well known and they are heavily defended. So in other words, while Russian forces were able to enter Ukraine instantly and easily, and despite that advantage, they were later defeated in most places, Chinese forces would have many obstacles and would suffer many casualties before they can land on Taiwanese territory. And the second reason is experience. Because the quality of the Russian military was certainly overestimated when we see the many problems they have in Ukraine in terms of logistics, communications, and human resources, among others. But the perception of the Russian military was shaped by previous campaigns in Syria, in Chechnya, in Georgia. So the Russian military may face many challenges in Ukraine, of course, but they are, as a matter of fact, they are experienced and they know how to fight. And the Russian population as well is resilient. The Russian families know the cost of war and they know what losing someone means. On the other hand, China, or at least the current soldiers and their families, they have absolutely no experience of war. And performance in war does not depend only on equipment. It does depend as well on human resources and of course on lessons learned from previous combats. So China is simply less prepared than Russia is to invade a country. And it's not only the soldiers, the families don't know what it is to lose their loved ones in action. And that is made even more difficult by the fact that for many Chinese families, this soldier may very well be their only son. So actually the social acceptability of the Chinese population to a cost of thousands or maybe dozens of thousands of casualties is completely unknown and presumably is quite low. It's clearly a vulnerability for the CCP, which is already facing unprecedented social protests because of COVID-19 lockdowns. So to sum up those 2 points, we can say that China is much less prepared to do something that is much more difficult than what Russia failed to do in Ukraine. So rationally, the Ukraine war shouldn't make a Chinese invasion of Taiwan more likely. On the contrary, the Ukraine war should make Xi Jinping, the CCP, and the PLA think twice before getting into a similar mess. Also, nothing will likely happen, it has been said yesterday as well, this year, because the risk of failure in the year of the 20th CCP Congress next October could cost Xi Jinping his job. After that, however, in the coming years, it's obviously more open. My guess is that China will not risk an invasion, which would be a last and desperate move. When they still have many cards in their hand, it's clearly now that we know that the disinformation campaigns and influence operation that China has been conducting for years are not working. And we attempted to demonstrate that in the Taiwan chapter of our recent report on Chinese influence operations. And the conclusion of this chapter is that the Chinese political war against Taiwan brought some tactical successes. Yes, you can point some tactical successes. You can show that it actually contributed to polarizing the Taiwanese society, but it is a strategic failure and even a counterproductive policy because a majority of the population has grown more distrustful of China. And in fact, the nationalist sentiment rises. The number of people that describe themselves as solely Taiwanese has never been higher. The Hong Kong crisis, of course, was no stranger to this, having acted as a powerful deterrent for the Taiwanese, and the government also took a number of measures to combat Chinese interference, which should make influence operations more difficult to conduct such operations in the future. More generally, it can be said that the increased aggressiveness of China against Taiwan, but also against the rest of the world, has considerably boosted the attractiveness of the island. We've seen in the last couple of years a lot of international visits of higher ranks in Taiwan, and so in a word, Chinese efforts to weaken and isolate Taiwan have had the opposite effect. So the three warfare strategy that we mentioned yesterday: psychological, public opinion, and legal warfares. Or as Cleo Pascal said, and I think it's a relevant term, entropic warfare, because it's from within, is and probably will stay their method of choice, because it would allow them to win without fighting. But clearly, until now, this hasn't been enough. However, between that and the full-scale invasion that we've been discussing, they have other options to gradually increase the pressure, like a massive cyber attack, a trade blockade, cutting submarine cables, or taking a couple of Taiwanese islands. That being said, I'm not saying that a full-scale invasion is impossible. It is actually possible for a couple of reasons. And the first is that actors are not always rational. So I was very rational previously, but actually it does not mean that those actors will be. And also because we may underestimate, or simply we may not understand what's at stake for them. And if you make the parallel between Xi Jinping and Putin, like Putin, Xi has his own mental blueprint. And as Stephen Jackson said yesterday, Xi is running out of great things to do. And actually taking Taiwan would be the greatest thing to do. It's at the top of the agenda because that would make Xi even more important than Mao. So just how we shouldn't have underestimated, and maybe we did, the symbolic importance for Putin to take Ukraine. We shouldn't underestimate the symbolic importance for Xi to take Taiwan. The second point is that the PRC propaganda will continue to deploy an aggressive discourse on unification by force. That is for psychological warfare purposes, the goal being, of course, to demoralize the Taiwanese troops and population, but also that is blurring our interpretation. It makes it difficult to read the intentions, the real intentions of the regime. And therefore, it's necessary to focus on the weak signals that we can collect. Number three is that China is waiting for the right moment, and they may actually think that they will soon have a historic window of opportunity, a no or never moment, and it will be when they think the US security guarantees will be at the lowest, when the US president won't have the stomach to ask his fellow citizens to die for Taipei. And it will be also before China's internal vulnerabilities catch up, because they have structural, demographic, and even economic vulnerabilities that will catch up someday, the goal being to fully integrate Taiwan by 2049. Yeah, I know, I'm almost done. Thank you. So if they decide to go for it, Beijing will also make sure that Japan will not side with Taiwan, if they can, and that could be done through a deal, as Bruno Tertre wrote in a scenario. I quote Bruno Tertre. So it's a scenario, so it's as if it's been done already. In late September, emissaries of Beijing secretly went to Tokyo to propose a groundbreaking deal. The PRC would publicly acknowledge Japan's sovereignty on the Senkaku-Diaoyu Islands, provided that Tokyo gave private assurances it would not interfere in the conflict over Taiwan and forbid the use of its territory for military purposes by any outside power during such a conflict, end of quote. So in this scenario, an invasion could happen at the end of the 2020s. And as Bruno Tertre also wrote, the attack could be conducted in the fall. It could be conducted actually after the October 4 anniversary celebration, taking advantage of the movements of troops needed for the massive parade and some massive military drills as well. And remember how the Russian invasion of Ukraine started, exactly like that, pretexting a massive military drill in Belarus. So October, he adds, was also a good month weather-wise, as I mentioned, with the limited chance of heavy storm. So just such a full-scale invasion would involve launching hundreds of ballistic and cruise missiles on strategic targets, and then an amphibious assault and having airborne commandos parachuted, and there will be heavy casualties on both sides, including potentially American citizens living on the island, and that could incite the US to become a co-belligerent. Taiwan will be damaged, Taiwan will be weakened, but it seems unlikely. I think that it will be conquered and fully occupied, as I said in my question yesterday, because there will be a strong resistance, and the nature of the terrain, mountains, would make it extremely difficult actually for China to fight in a form of guerrilla warfare. Now, my last question, and that's the conclusion, sorry, I've been too long, is how would France react? So I said at the beginning, France is an Indo-Pacific nation with strong interests in the stability of the region, and also thousands of troops already deployed in the region. So the question is legitimate, how France would likely react. So the answer is that it's difficult to say. What seems likely is that in the phase before the conflict, when tensions rise, France, probably the UK and probably other European forces would build up their military presence in the region to ensure freedom of navigation, in particular in strategic points like Straits, Malacca and Lombok. Now the question is, would France enter in a direct fight? Would France be a co-belligerent? And to that, I cannot answer for two reasons. The first is that we need to maintain a strategic ambiguity for deterrence purposes. So if there is a plan, we should not disclose the plan in advance. And the second reason is that it's also, and above all, a question of context. Answering such a question in the abstract is meaningless. Everyone can speculate about what they would be doing without committing to anything concrete. However, in practice, the reaction of France and other actors would depend on the specific context, on what triggered the conflict, who started it, what is also the normative framework, why, in terms of international law being violated, how does the escalation unfold? Is the conflict geographically limited, or is it expanded? If yes, is it directly threatening French interests? What is the reaction of the so-called international community, and so on? So I'm fully aware that this answer is frustrating because it's not an answer, but I strongly believe that we cannot give an answer in the abstract to such a question, how we would react in such a situation. And I thank you for your attention. Sorry, I've been too long, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Baptiste. Tereza, you're next.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, to Justin and UQAM for inviting me. When I saw the conference title, such a provocative title, I thought, well, I must be here. Of course, it didn't have anything to do with, thinking, oh, I can also have such a wonderful trip to Montreal, right? In any case, I'm extremely happy to be here and part of this endeavor, and all the panels and all other speakers on this panel set the bar so high, so it will be quite a challenge for me. And I must warn you right at the beginning that there will be a little bit of disappointment on my part, because I'm actually not German, although I'm supposed to talk about German experience. Perhaps I'm an honorary German because I've been working at German University now for more than 3 years, but I'm actually Czech. So I will also try to include some input from my homeland, or say Central and Eastern Europe. And also a little bit mention the European Union as a whole. So to put it more positively, you may get 2 or even 3 in 1 in my presentation. As much as Jean-Baptiste, I also received 3 questions from Justin. What lessons should Germany draw from the war in Ukraine for Taiwan? How would Germany react, and does Germany anticipate the war? So I will structure my comments mainly around the first question, so about the lessons from the war in Ukraine, and I think we actually complement each other very well. Lots of the lessons Jean-Baptiste just mentioned, I arrived at the same conclusions, but maybe I will formulate it slightly differently. And I will try to answer the other questions throughout, or maybe at the end. So in the end, I came up with 10 lessons. I hope I will manage to talk about all of them within 15 minutes. But also, I would like to point out at the very beginning that, of course, we can't make any, one-to-one comparisons. As Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And hopefully the war in Ukraine, by the time there may be any conflict in Taiwan, it's going to be really a history in Europe. So first of all, the first lesson, and that's the question of timing. Jean-Baptiste talked about that too. The war in Ukraine started on 24th of February. I think back about Munich Security Conference, which took place on the 18th through 20th of February. So, just several days before the actual invasion. It was the last occasion when President Zelensky actually traveled abroad. He also met Vice President Kamala Harris there. But when I think about the discussions there, the feeling was, of course, the situation in Ukraine is the hot topic, but, Putin is not crazy. He's not going to invade. I think that was my sort of takeaway from there. And yet, of course, we know what happened several days after. And we know that the Europeans, but also partly Americans, but mainly Europeans, didn't sort of mentally analyze the possibility that the invasion may happen, despite all the US intelligence. Despite also what several countries like my home country, but mainly the Baltics, were saying that it may happen. And then that took place a day later, still despite Vladimir Putin's speech on 21st of February, where he quite clearly said what he wants to do and recognize the independent republics. So when we look at a possible situation in Taiwan, we should sort of forget about our wishful thinking, but to actually look at things on the ground. So, if we see amassing troops, if we see also things like, spikes in energy prices, which happened before the invasion, we should really pay attention to that. We should also listen to the people involved. So, people really didn't listen to Vladimir Putin, and he clearly said what he wants to do. So we should definitely listen to Xi Jinping, what he's going to say, for instance, at the Congress, but other speeches as well. And we should also listen to those around Taiwan. Perhaps we may listen a little bit less to those in Taiwan, because actually the Ukrainians at the time were also like, calm down, nothing is happening. But that may be just a coincidence. That brings me to the second lesson. I think Jean-Baptiste mentioned that too. There's a question of madman theory versus rational actors. I have some thoughts about, Vladimir Putin. We can maybe talk about it later on. But when we actually look at the constellation of leaders in Europe and in the West in general, I think it was really a window of opportunity for Putin to invade. Chancellor Scholz, although he has portrayed himself as as sort of the Merkel 2.0, he is quite clearly a weak chancellor. Also, in terms of France, we had presidential elections, and it wasn't clear at the time whether Marine Le Pen, the right-wing extremist leader, how well she will do. And of course, the Russians have been supporting her party quite extensively. And, we just think what the situation is like in the United States internally or domestically. So when we think about potential window of opportunity, we should also look at, the constellation in other countries, not just in China and in Taiwan. Of course, the biggest lesson or experience is the actual military aspects of the invasion. I think we've discussed it a lot. I think at the moment in Europe, there is sort of a consensus that Russians planned a quick takeover in Ukraine and it didn't work out. And then there's a question of why it didn't work out, partly surely because the Russians probably overestimated their own skills, but possibly also because they underestimated the Ukrainian resistance, but also equipment. And this is where we sort of see where Germany comes in, and that's clearly the Achilles heel of German government, because it is expected that Germany will keep delivering heavy weaponry. It has promised to do so, but so far the actual results are quite weak. It's true that Chancellor Scholz talked about Zeitwende, or a turning point in German foreign policy, just a few days after the invasion happened, and promised 100 billion euro in a special budget line for the German military or German army to muscle up, for Bundeswehr to actually become a proper army. But that's a long-term project. But by the time there is potential conflict in Taiwan, it's likely that Germany will actually beef up its forces. But the other question is or would Germany be willing to actually supply any weapons to Taiwan? And I think here, I mean, it's my guess, but I think I can say no. I mean, if we see the hesitation on the part of current German government to supply weapons to Ukraine, which is a conflict in Germany's backyard, it's hard to imagine that the German government would be willing to send something, to Indo-Pacific. But of course, it may also depend who will be in charge by then. So who's been doing this support at the moment? That's actually countries like mine, mainly Central and Eastern Europe, but also Baltics and Nordics. And as a result of it, Germany is actually losing lots of credibility within the European Union as a leader. So one of my colleagues called Germany as a reluctant hegemon within the EU. I think nowadays Germany is seen just as reluctant, no longer a hegemon. And we can, discuss what consequences it may have also to weight of Germany in the Indo-Pacific. There are a few other lessons which we haven't really discussed too much regarding potential conflict in Taiwan. One of which is possible influx of refugees. So I don't know, if there is an invasion, Chinese invasion of Taiwan, whether the Taiwanese would actually start fleeing and, which route they would take. Obviously, it's an island, so it's much more difficult than Ukrainians going through Poland and other countries. But we should also think about this question. And this is, on the other hand, I think where Germany has been quite supportive. So Germany has been accepting refugees a lot and also been helping financially, although the biggest burden is mainly on Poland. The fifth aspect I would like to mention is all sorts of atrocities which are happening in Ukraine, and we've discussed it a little bit actually over dinner. Just to mention massacres in Bucha or Mariupol, and there's a question whether this is a systemic issue or just individual soldiers behaving, inhumanely. But from the German and possible Taiwanese perspective would be, so if that were to happen in Taiwan, what would be the reaction, especially the international action? And from the German perspective, I think Germany would be willing to, for instance, send investigators or sources to collect the evidence, which is what German government at least said it would do, and I think it's happening on the ground already. Although of course the access is a big question. Number 6 now is a question of local allies. So when we saw the map of the Ukraine, in the eastern parts, there is a lot of, the areas of Donetsk and Luhansk were originally sort of said to be denazified because there is a Russian-speaking population. Obviously, in the question of Taiwan, we don't have any, different speakers than Chinese speakers, so this may not be the case. But still, we can think whether China could possibly create some pockets of local allies, who would be, for instance, linked to stage fake referendum, for instance, on some of the islands, right? So we should also think about this option. And of course, Germany has been very critical of this. And so at least in that diplomatic sphere, Germany was quite involved. Then the seventh point, which we've mentioned a lot already, and as a question of sanctions. Germany, European Union, or the West has imposed unprecedented sanctions on Russia from the European perspective. Until very recently, the most sanctioned country in the world was DPRK. So now North Korea has lost the pleasure of being the most sanctioned country by the Europeans, and it's nowadays Russia. Of course, sanctions are important not just for their effect, but also for the show of unity. There's always been concern in Europe and in Germany that these sanctions hurt Russia more than they hurt EU or Germany. And there were probably 3 types of sanctions imposed: economic sanctions, personal sanctions against all sorts of oligarchs and people involved in the Ukrainian conflict, and also sanctions on those providing propaganda and disinformation. So should there be any conflict in Taiwan? The big question is, would Germany be willing to join sanctions against China? At the moment, given the economic interests of Germany, I think it would be quite difficult for German government. But at the same time, I think that this would be one thing that German government would be willing to do step by step. But that's probably one response that Germany would join. In a way, Germany is already learning from the Ukrainian or Russian experience. And there's been lots of discussion about decoupling from China, or at least limiting its dependence on China in terms of economics. And also for sort of making it a bit more difficult for German businesses to actually make business in China, in a sense that, for instance, Volkswagen requested German state support for its investment, and the German government, for the first time in history, refused to give these guarantees. So in a way, Volkswagen is on its own nowadays in China. But to some extent, it is also interesting to observe what the Chinese are doing in this regard. And as far as I know, President Xi ordered his CCP members abroad to divest their properties. It's gonna probably take some time, but I can just say from my own experience, I've lived so far in 3 apartments in Germany, and 2 of those were owned by Chinese. So let's see, maybe I was just lucky or unlucky, whichever way you take it, but I think this is going to be, sort of a long-term policy as well. Then eighth aspect, and that's global partners. And global partners, both for China in case it would invade, and for the US and the West in terms of reaction. So if there was any invasion of Taiwan, would China actually even need supporters, global partners around the world, or would it just like do it on its own and don't care who is supporting it? Probably Russia and maybe North Korea and some of the usual suspects would support it, but would actually need any factual support. And we've talked a lot about the neutrality of India and all sorts of countries in Southeast Asia and being critical of them. So if there is any invasion of Taiwan, how would Germany actually react? And if there is potentially the same constellation of politicians in the government as it is now, wouldn't actually Germany possibly be in the same position as some of the countries in Asia at the moment? So perhaps condemning the invasion, but not actually doing much on the ground. So as I think Yoonji said about South Korea, that it was slow and limited in its response. Maybe this is what Germany would also do. And of course, there is also a question of NATO. So if there is an invasion of Taiwan from the Chinese perspective, would the US get involved militarily? And if it does, would the US actually invoke Article 5 of the NATO treaty? And that would definitely change the equation for everyone within the NATO, definitely for Germany too. So I know that I have very little time left, but I still wanted to think a little bit about the end game. Lots of people in Germany at the moment, those on the left, think that the war in Ukraine needs to end in some kind of peace settlement, which would be based on mutual concessions and probably, Ukraine sort of giving up some territory to Russia. If you think about Taiwan situation, can we also envisage sort of a partition of Taiwan? I think almost everyone here thinks that if there is an invasion, China would just basically take it all or not. But I think this could also be a potential outcome. So sort of China taking over some parts of the island, and how would that work? Like in Cyprus, for instance. And in that case, Germany would probably be willing to get involved as some kind of mediator, facilitator, negotiator, and so on. I think Gaëlle mentioned reconstruction, and that you think that China would be really interested in reconstruction of Ukraine. I'm a little bit more skeptical on this point, because I think that's what the EU wants to do and will do, and will actually want to prevent China from becoming, the power which would actually be in charge of reconstruction. But if you think about the situation in Taiwan, especially if there would be either unsuccessful invasion. I mean, we sort of assume that once China invades, that it's gonna work out basically. But in the Russian scenario, we've seen it doesn't necessarily need to be the case, or if there is some kind of a partition. So who would also participate in sort of reconstructing either the whole island after the invasion or part of the island? And probably both Germany and the EU would be very happy to get involved, as long as they get some say in the outcome. And in terms of institutional setup, Ukraine has been offered EU membership, although it's going to take some time before Ukraine is potentially ready. But that also gives some lessons for Taiwan and how to deal with it in terms of membership in different international organizations. I think UN agencies were mentioned. But also nowadays, the EU is thinking much more about bilateral investment agreements with Taiwan, which hasn't taken place yet. And in fact, today there was a trade and investment dialogue between the Director General of DG Trade of the European Commission, Sabine Weyand, and Taiwan's economic minister. And there's been lots of discussions about semiconductor supply chains, coercion, and export control instruments. So there is a movement on the EU part to sort of bring Taiwan a bit closer in terms of economic terms and institutional terms. And the last point I want to make, that's about strategies. Jean-Baptiste talked a lot about France's Indo-Pacific strategy. Germany also has its own Indo-Pacific strategy, and actually these two plus a few others were sort of a basis for EU Indo-Pacific strategy, which is quite new. I must say that the German strategy doesn't mention Taiwan once. The EU strategy is a bit better in that regard. So I think that there are slight movements ahead. Czech Republic is currently working on its own strategy. So in a way, the experience from Ukraine is also, changing minds in terms of strategic thinking in Europe. And I think both national governments, but also the EU level is really, changing its approach to Taiwan and to Indo-Pacific in general. And I guess we can discuss more details of it later on. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Tereza. Charles-Philippe David?
Tereza? I may need that, nice. I think, or not. Bonjour tout le monde. Je tiens à vous rassurer que Jean-Baptiste et moi ne nous sommes pas consultés. Funnily enough, when I woke up this morning, U.S. intelligence is saying that it's more likely that actually we have an implosion in North Korea than an invasion of Taiwan. So I thought that would bring the good or the bad news. North Korea, because of the terrible effects of the pandemic and the lack of management in that country of the pandemic. Okay, I want to thank, of course, Justin. It's really nice, really kind, actually, for the opportunity to address this audience or this conference. It's not the first time that we need to address threats in the wake of a defining moment, and this is surely one of them. However, that being said, and I keep looking at that beautiful poster, I was frankly taken aback by it and the title of the conference. It's eye-grabbing for sure. I asked myself, though, if we were defining and anticipating a threat with the right words. It is almost as if, war for sure, like Thanos, is coming. Not a neutral question, so to speak, like, say, the future of Taiwan security and, say, the role of the United States. Then that thought led me back to my old teachings and debates with my graduate students over 30 years in my security seminar before Justin took over. It's not the first time that threats may be overestimated or wrongly estimated. And by the way, Ukraine was neither, this time, at least, with US intelligence. So let me delve on three questions. Scholarly work on threats and analysis or relevance of analysis of Taiwan. All right, let us keep in mind some scholarly conclusions that may be relevant to the case of Taiwan. Let me introduce or recall three scholars who I think have made major contributions over decades assessing threats. There are many, many, many others, but I think they're less flamboyant than the three I'm presenting to you this morning, or I believe. First, no surprise, first and foremost, gold medalist, John Mueller. I think if John were here, he would argue that in this specific instance, That's why I was happy to hear Jean-Baptiste. The Chinese threat might be slightly overblown for a couple of reasons. One, that the threat assessment is always subjective and not always based on facts. And indeed, no convergence here. Taiwan is not Ukraine. Taiwan is an island. I wrote that. And two, the threat may be exaggerated and may lead to overreaction, which is why, or what I'm concerned with is overreaction. He might also think, if he were here, that there's a vested interest in alarmism about Taiwan based on Ukraine that might contribute to deteriorate rather than enhancing Taiwan's security. Now, I do not know myself. I'm not going to take positions to answer the question, but I think it's worth at least asking. Second medalist, Christopher Feitweiss. He has written extensively about threat inflation over the years and threat anxiety. Taiwan may be actually a case of both. Insecurity, he argues, expands with power, and is exactly what seems to be happening with China. Our readings of history may apply or may not about China. Realists often refer to hegemonic stability or instability, the Thucydides gap, rise and fall of great powers. Are these frameworks irreversible and preordained, the way we theorize about them? I am not convinced. His main conclusion, Feitweiss, though is relevant, once lit, perceived security fires are hard to extinguish. It's an interesting observation. The tendency to assume the worst, like that title, may indeed fuel over-belligerence and overreaction, if not misperceptions. The question I believe here is, are we misreading the enemy? Cooperative approaches in diplomacy, for example, may be judged a waste of time and counterproductive, especially in the wake of Ukraine. Is China like Russia? Is it always 1938? I do not know, frankly. No answer on my part. Last and not least, Chaim Kaufman, bronze medal. He argues that a huge trap in debates about threats is the lack of debate, which he calls the failure of the marketplace. We are not there yet with Taiwan. There are plenty of arguments on all sides. Nevertheless, we may get there in the years ahead and after Ukraine, especially if there's a consensus in the US, that's what I will be talking about the way that the issue of Taiwan should be handled. The danger Kaufman raised was issue manipulation for political purposes. Let us at least be aware that Taiwan is not exempt from manipulation for partisan purposes, to either intervene or not. The latter being more popular with public opinion, but that was before Ukraine. The question is now, how will policy entrepreneurs, Vincent, frame the US policy response to Taiwan? I do not know. I don't know much. But I suspect that the framing and the answer are unpredictable given the turbulent state of US politics. All right, question number 2. How the Ukraine context influences analysis of Taiwan. And that's really a rejoinder here. There is no way to know for sure how one existing war, Ukraine, may influence the eruption of another, Taiwan. My hunch is that there are probably 3 consequences that Ukraine has on Taiwan, which are relevant to threat analysis and the US posture, which I will get to. First is the notion of surprise. I think that what happened and what happens in Ukraine has possibly cooled off hot heads in Beijing. As DIA Director Scott Berrier has stated last month, she has certainly taken notice of all the difficulties and setbacks of the Russian army and the determination of Ukraine to fight. I think the so-called, you probably talked about it yesterday, quote unquote, porcupine strategy is a clear indication of adaptation on the part of Taipei and the realization that defense is more than weaponry. In other words, quote unquote, that's the porcupine strategy, make Taiwan a pricklier, I love that English word, pricklier target for China. And the question then is, who is learning better, China or Taiwan, from the experience in Ukraine, as you pointed out? Second is the view of China as 10 feet tall. It may be, maybe 20 feet tall. China, though, is facing grave and serious trouble ahead, and no one knows how military ventures fit into the decision-making of the Chinese ruler. I tend to think, I'm not a Chinese specialist, that she is more intelligent, though far more rational than Putin. He surely knows that his country is growing old, more indebted in the short term, at least, less prosperous, and mostly in need, more than Putin, of international stability, especially if for no other reason, for trade purposes. To ensure what? Economic survival and, yes, security, if we define it as growth and prosperity for China. Thirdly is the overall direction and architecture of East Asian security. There is, I believe, a trend similar to what we see in Europe, minus a NATO-like institution which is absent. More bandwagoning by allies toward the US is taking place, and not something we would have predicted, because of fear of China, which of course is a positive development, I think, for Taiwan. Say that Japan would welcome US nuclear weapons on its soil. Wow. And that voices are actually raised to argue that South Korea become a NATO associate. Speak to me volumes to that bandwagoning effect. Those three developments bring, I believe, nuance to the tendency of overestimating the China threat. That being said, now let me talk about my topic. What does the Biden administration say and think? I think there are three important dimensions to the evolving US posture. That was mentioned by all of you. First, the strategy of ambiguity, which President Biden, I think, has more or less cleared up for the third time of his presidency, to the point where you would think, for God's name, that must be deliberate, as he would say. The president says that he would come to the defense of Taiwan and intervene militarily. And then his aides tell us the policy has not really changed. What we have here is simultaneous deterrence and uncertainty as to how the US would react if China attacked Taiwan. And I thought of this beautiful phrase, the risk that leaves something to chance, to quote Thomas Schelling. The debate rages right now. I'm just going to give you a small sample. That's all I can do. Richard Hawes of the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as Admiral James Stavridis in Time, for instance, have written both that it is high time that ambiguity be dispensed with and strategic clarity be asserted. On the other hand, a recent war game conducted by the Center for New American Security predicts unavoidable escalation between the two nuclear powers and consequently the failure of deterrence if China decided to go to war on Taiwan. Read the fascinating debate between Matthew Koenig and Emma Ashford last week on Foreign Policy's site. I think, personally now, I'm going to commit myself for once, that Biden, Hawes, Stavridis, and Koenig are right. Such a posture, I also believe, by the way, should have been adopted years ago in the case of Ukraine. But that's another topic. Second is the need to develop between Washington and Taipei a so-called war-winning strategy. This is where I'm a hawk, actually, a real one. In order to do that, Washington has and should continue to provide Taipei with abundance of accurate weapons, weapon systems for use against, it was mentioned, ships and planes, as Taiwan's National Defense Assessment last year actually requested. The strategy here goes beyond the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act and promise of provision, as you know, of arms of defensive character only. Clearly, after Ukraine, the Pentagon, I believe, has certainly concluded that this caveat or restriction should be questioned and lifted. Thirdly is the clear need to increase cooperation, obviously, between allies and partners in order to increase what? Costs of an attack or invasion of Taiwan in the mind of Beijing. That includes strategic partners like the Quad, the Asian NATO, as Beijing likes to call it, as much as economic partners, such as it was mentioned, the new Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, arguably a shaky, but yet I think vital project. That also strengthens, it was really not very mediatized, the argument that Biden made in Tokyo of supporting Japan becoming a permanent member of the Security Council. Well, it's not very noticed. And hence play a larger role, a larger regional defense role in order to contain China. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I personally believe that the Indo-Pacific Command is right to argue that an attack on Taiwan is unlikely within the next 24 months and probably not before the 2027 PLA's military modernization target. All good reason to reinforce the porcupine strategy on the part of Taiwan and reassert Washington's commitment to Taipei's defense. Otherwise, the island of Taiwan may indeed one day become one huge, big aircraft carrier, to quote Kronig, that China would use to project power in the region. Finally, Americans have to ask themselves and answer two fundamental questions. One, is Taiwan a vital US interest? Yes or no? And two, for what purpose? For what purpose? That should give us an indication of commitment or retrenchment, because after all, this is the hard choice that America faces in the years ahead and which will undoubtedly determine the future of Taiwan and East Asia security. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Charles-Philippe. Thank you very much to all of you for a fascinating panel. I really enjoyed it. I would like to start with a couple of questions that I have for all of you or for some of you, depending on the questions. We're talking here about a possible confrontation between China and the United States. We haven't talked a lot about the potential of a nuclear war between the two, between a direct confrontation, but this is really the core element here of this discussion. At least that's how I look at it. When people were asking President Biden, why is it that you are not sending troops to Ukraine? The president said, well, that's a world war. If the Americans and the Russians start fighting in Ukraine, it's the beginning of a war. It's potentially the beginning of a nuclear war. And so I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about this potential scenario, which is catastrophic when you think about it. And I find that this wasn't really talked about in your presentations. Now, with respect, to France, when we look at the Europeans, what we understand is that Russia is a bigger threat to them than China is. And when we go back to the debates within NATO over the last couple of years, I think that this is pretty clear. And so maybe this question would be for Jean-Baptiste. Wouldn't it be hard for France to mobilize other European countries who don't have territories in the Pacific to either adopt a common position or at least to respond quickly and to do something in common with respect to the potentiality of China's invasion of Taiwan? Another question, this one for Gaëlle. You said, Gaëlle, that now is the time for Canada to shift from a defensive to a more proactive posture in the current context. Could you develop a little bit more about this? Because we do have a lot of discussions about what Canada should do in the world, but at the end of the day, I'm not always sure I understand what Canada should actually do in the world. So maybe you have some interesting ideas to share with us. For Charles-Philippe David, my take is that if President Trump or former President Trump would be in the White House right now, President Putin would probably be in Kiev, right?
And Trump too.
And Trump would probably be there for a photo op or something like that, right? So what would happen to Taiwan if invaded by China under another Trump administration or under a Trumpist administration, say in January of 2025, which is a very likely scenario to have another Republican like Trump in the White House or Trump himself? And so what does it would say to what could actually happen in Taiwan following an invasion? A question to Tereza. You talked a little bit about the Indo-Pacific strategy of Germany, and you talked a little bit about the EU strategy. Could you tell us a little bit more about the cooperation between Paris and Berlin on that topic? Is there sort of a common view with respect to Taiwan and what should be done for Taiwan in case of an invasion? So to which extent are these two important players in Europe on the same page on the issue of Taiwan? So I will stop here and hopefully we'll have a great discussion, so all of us in the next 30 minutes, 35 minutes. So who would like to start? Gaëlle, why don't you go?
Yeah, I'll address a question about.
Go ahead.
I'll address a question about from a not necessarily defensive. I actually don't think it's defensive. I think it's actually reactive, which is very different.
You said reactive.
Yeah,
it's
yes, but it's and I think there's an important distinction here because investing in our defenses could actually be proactive, I would argue.
Yeah.
And we've been very reactive, for example, in continental defense rather than proactively defensive. But I think what I mean by that is not necessarily in terms of, and I do believe that it's up to the government to decide where to go. And I don't really want to engage in that debate, but I think being proactive also starts with where we're investing in our government and in our capabilities and capacity. And I think, generally speaking, we need to make a switch from less emphasis on crisis response and more on detecting and signaling our intentions. And that can be done both through military means and diplomatic means. I also would like to see us adopting a longer time horizon in terms of evaluating threats, evaluating challenges to Canada's national defense. And a proactive approach is also about, we talk a lot about investment in Canadian Armed Forces, but I think there's a greater, like where investment is actually required is really in those new domains of operation in collaboration with national security agencies. So whether it's cyber, information, intelligence, and so on. And also in line with the report by Thomas Junot and Vincent Rigby, I think there's a need to actually, it's not about creating new things, but making sure that what we have actually work really well. And so that we can take informed decisions across government on where these investments should be, but that requires really good intelligence and coordinations between departments. On top of that, like from a more, I would say, the softer side, there's a need to be more creative about partnership. And with that, I mean, for example, engaging with rising democracies in developing democracies. And so, yes, we have invested a lot of resources in our relationship with Europe, with the United States, with the Western partners, but I think there are options where Canada could actually be a key player in engaging with democracies in Latin America and in Sub-Saharan Africa. We tend to not look at Latin America, and the fact that nobody's investing there in terms of protection of democracy is starting to backfire. And I don't know, honestly, from a personal perspective on that, and I wrote about this, I don't know what are we waiting for the house to be on fire to actually start looking at the strategic importance of Latin America for the defense of North America? I think this is a really big strategic mistake that has been done like through several decades. And then I also think that Canada, we've been, the Minister Joly pointed out that Canada wants to position itself as bringing actors together, bringing countries together. And if this is what we want to do, therefore, we actually have to make sure that we are a strong advocate for maintaining dialogue, even when it's really difficult, and maintaining forums open. Because if we're to focus on crisis response, then the first thing we tend to do is, cut the line. But it is actually through those mechanisms of communication and dialogue that we can actually prevent escalation and find solutions to crisis that are non-military or that will not escalate. And I'm thinking especially, I'm very worried about the Arctic situation and diplomacy in the Arctic. We've been talking about how the exclusivity of the Arctic Council was actually creating creating stability. And now that the Arctic Council will not meet, I understand why, but we're still in a position where, okay, so how do we actually speak to another power that has interest in the same region as us that are not necessarily opposed on several issues? How do we make sure that we maintain that stability and in the Arctic, and that no other extra regional actors are actually using that spike between countries in the region to advance their interests? And finally, last point on that, I also think that diplomacy and engagement should go with being more proactive in engaging with the private sector, Canadian corporations, and using them also as, and leveraging their influence abroad to actually improve the Canadian image, but also, and Canadian influence on the ground. And I think this partnership between government and the private sector can really help, both in terms of diplomacy, economic trade, but also national security.
Thank you, Gaëlle. Jean-Baptiste.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with you, Jonathan. I think it's a very good point. Obviously, it would be quite hard to mobilize other European countries to react, but it's not a new thing. It's so one of the very common difficulties within the European defense framework, and we've been seeing that with the Sahel as well. But I would say there are three ways to do it. One is that there are already national and even a continental interest in the Indo-Pacific. So Indo-Pacific is on the map for other countries as well. Tereza mentioned the German strategy. There are other national strategies, and there is an EU strategy. And those countries, they don't have a strategy on the Sahel, but they do have a strategy on the Indo-Pacific. So there is already an interest, and we can just expect that interest to be growing in the next years. So when this will be happening in 5-10 years, if it happens someday, there will be even a bigger interest, both nationally and at the level of the European Union in the Indo-Pacific. Second, I think the transactional approach is kind of working. This is what we've been doing with Estonia, for example. We did convince Estonia to go fight in the Sahel. They have absolutely no interest in nationally in doing so, but they have a transactional interest, because if they do that for us, then we do the reassurance measures in their sky. So this is how actually you gradually build European defense. At the beginning, it's a contract. It's based on reciprocity, but gradually they understand that they have an interest in fighting in the Sahel, also because they understand that it's not the East or the South in terms of threats, and we have to think 360 degrees, because actually the East may be in the South. Actually, the Russians, if your main threat is, if your main concern are the Russians, as it's the case with the Estonians or the Baltic states in general. Well, you find them in the Sahel as well. So once you understand that, you understand that it's not even a transaction anymore. But at the beginning, initially it was. And my third answer would be that, if it happens in 5, 10, 15 years, then we'll have a different European defense. And probably there will be, European defense will be more integrated, more cohesive. When you think of all the improvements that we've made in the last 5 years, for example. So if you project a European defense in 5 to 15 years, it will be different from what we know today. So we can expect probably more solidarity, even if something happens very far from the continental Europe, like in the Indo-Pacific. But I would say, so those are the 3 ways of doing it, but I would say the main problem will be material. The main problem will simply be, will we have enough vessels? It takes planes, it takes vessels, and the European countries, not all of them have many means to deploy so far from Europe. So it means concretely that we need to build up our presence, and when I say our, I mean European presence in the Indo-Pacific in the coming years, in the event of something like that happening in 5 to 15 years.
Tereza?
Yes. So maybe first on your question about nuclear confrontation, which
Yes.
I think no one has picked up yet. This is actually one of the issues which is quite present in the German debate, because there is a part of especially sort of left-leaning politicians, academics, but also activists who are basically saying, well, we can't deliver any weapons to Ukraine because that's gonna provoke a nuclear war, and that's basically something we all need to avoid. I would say countries or governments like the Czech one usually sort of counter that argument. Well, if we don't support Ukraine at the moment, then the situation will deteriorate, and then we will maybe end up with nuclear war. So it's not, if we deliver weapons now, we still have a chance to prevent it. But if we let Vladimir Putin to do whatever he wants, then we will end up with nuclear war anyway. So in a way, to put it in German historical context, the discussion is Vladimir Putin more like Kaiser Wilhelm? So we should sort of we should not sort of enter into arms race with him, or is he more like a Hitler? And we have to stop him as soon as possible. I don't have an answer to that, but let's see. And your question about Taiwan and Indo-Pacific.
And cooperation between Paris and Berlin.
Yes. Well, I would say maybe even cooperation between the 2 capitals in Central and Eastern Europe, because actually it is becoming Central and Eastern Europe, with the exception of Hungary and the Baltics, which are becoming much more hawkish on Taiwan and much more willing to engage with Taiwan. We've talked a little bit about Lithuania and the economic boycott by China because of them allowing to open representative office in Vilnius. But the Czech government also was quite involved in Taiwan. There's been visits to Taiwan, which caused also, Wang Yi saying that we will pay heavy price. So far that didn't happen, but still the threats were there. So it is, and also what's interesting that in the past 16+1 or 17+1 was seen as sort of Trojan horse of China in Europe, sort of peeling off parts of Central and Eastern Europe which are in the EU and the rest which isn't. But I think the countries which are in the EU and part of 16+1 are becoming more and more dissatisfied or unhappy with the framework. And that clearly didn't help China at all. So actually, I think and also because of the experience with Russia these days, I think Central and Eastern Europe is becoming much more actually hawkish on Taiwan and supportive for Taiwan. So there may be need of coordinating between those capitals and Paris and Berlin, which I think is at the moment a more reluctant one. But even there on China, I think we can see changes because the government in Berlin is not just Chancellor Scholz from Social Democrats, but also the two other parties, the Greens and the Liberals. And definitely the Greens and the Liberals are much tougher on China and are supportive of Taiwan. So, you know, it's also part of the domestic situation in Berlin. So let's see how things evolve.
Thank you. Charles-Philippe?
Well, Jonathan, it so happens that centuries ago, I wrote my PhD dissertation on nuclear strategy. And I'm saying this because one of my advisors who took a long time explaining to me nuclear strategy was, do you know Klaus Knorr by name?
No, I don't.
Klaus Knorr was one of the wise golden age strategists of nuclear strategy who worked with greater names, more recognized, like Kissinger, like Herman Kahn. Bernard Brodie was his mentor.
Okay.
And Klaus Knorr always said the beauty and the horror of nuclear strategy is that you never know. Hence, my answer would be, I don't know, and it's good that we don't know. Now, I did quote the war simulation exercise that was done and reported 2 weeks or 10 days ago by the Center for American Security. And their conclusion was that in their exercise, we love simulations, that the result was a disaster, simply a disaster. So it's the best educated answer I can give you, is that both sides would lose. Now, my hunch, because the threat that leaves something to chance, another great strategist that Knorr liked to quote, shows us that probably the onus of taking the risk would be on China's part. And if I was modestly part of that debate in Washington, inside the government, I would say, let's make it even more so that the onus of the decision should be on Beijing's side rather than our side. And the war simulation points out to the fact that who is right or who is wrong in this, that if Beijing thinks it's losing, say its aggression against Taiwan, because Taiwan, we said so, is well defended, the US is committed, allies are coming, it's not looking good, that's when, or perhaps where, Chinese leaders might want to escalate. We're in the same, somewhat, scenario we were with Putin. So I would argue in conclusion that the best strategy, I think, is to make sure that Taiwan is conventionally well defended, defended with conventional weapons, that the US commitment is very, very clear. And this will lead to my second answer to your second question. There's an obvious link between what I'm saying here and you guess what I'm going to answer about the second question. That the commitment is very clear to Beijing. And I think the problem here is when you uncommit or you discommit, you commit in the passive way, which leaves, and this is nuclear strategy, and it's good it's never been used because it's only extrapolation. The other side will believe that it can attack because you won't react. That's not what you want to do. Of course, the best strategy, and I suppose politically is totally unfeasible, would be to have some sort of tripwire. I'm part of the generation that really thinks that the tripwire strategy worked. I may be wrong. I'm open to be totally dismissed, but I really believe that the Tripwire strategy in Europe worked. How can you implement a Tripwire strategy with Taiwan? Now, that's a very, very, very difficult question to answer, and I don't have the answer. Although I thought, when was it? 3 months ago, when the president of Taiwan did not dismiss the information that American special ops were on Taiwan territory, on Taiwan soil. I thought, well, perhaps we're getting there. You don't say it, but you do it. Okay, and this then leads me to my very quick second answer is Americans have to understand that there's a national interest for them. Under Trump, it would have been, and it would be still a disaster, a catastrophe. I'm going to go and hide in the Great North somewhere and just disappear because with Trump, I mean, you're getting into a fifth dimension, and yeah. I mean, I'm not going to delve into this because, like I answered very spontaneously to you, he would be in Kyiv taking a photo up on the and promised that he would reconstruct a hotel in Kyiv and it would be called the Trump Tower or maybe the Trump Putin Tower. How nice! And I can hear him talking, and it would be just total utter nonsense. So if we're back in the more rational world, the problem here is, and I wrote about this and I made my conference in Paris on that, is that foreign policy now in the US is all about domestic politics, unfortunately. Ukraine may change this. Ukraine, may erode that sense that, well, all is subordinated to what Congress, public opinion, and what else, and the Tucker Carlsons of this world think and say. There was once upon a time, presidents who were taking sometimes decisions that were not totally subordinated to public opinion and in the American interest in the way they believed it. I always mentioned to students, if Truman had listened to American public opinion, NATO would have never, ever existed, ever. So I think Biden has that national interest sense or feeling or hunch or whoop, and that what he said in Poland, what he said elsewhere, reflect his instinct of hey, we have a role to play in the world. So if Biden were, I'm more confident, of course, in a Biden committing to Taiwan than a Trumpist or whoever, a DeSantis, as president. But clearly now public opinion in the U.S. is to be generous, no more than half committed, and I'm being generous or conservative in favor of committing to the defense of Taiwan. That's very weak. That's quite weak. And so if a Trump comes back and said, well, we have no grudge in that, and Xi is a great man and blah, 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 and doesn't believe that democracy needs not to be promoted, ma'am, but to be defended. Now we're in the defense of democracy phase. We're not in the promotion anymore of democracy. We taught for 15, 20 years about democracy promotion, blah, 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 and missions and operation. Now we're into defense of democracy. If no one in the US does not commit to the defense of democracy, we're done. We're toast, we're history. Thank you. My
Thank you
pleasure.
very much. All right, Charles?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I talked yesterday about the economic reasons as to why I didn't think invasion was going to happen in the next 10 to 20 years, but a number of people have talked about this 5-year window opportunity. And I just wanted to get the my fellow Europeans' reaction to my reasoning as to why CCP is not going to defenestrate itself even in those 5 years. Because one of the things that they're looking at really carefully at the moment, the Chinese, is the nature of the financial sanctions, the freezing of the foreign exchange funds, the expulsion from SWIFT, et cetera, et cetera. And that is, they're not going to invade until they've worked out what the consequences are. And therefore, what we need to do is to make it very clear to China that we will impose these sorts of sanctions upon them and freeze their assets, etc. We know what that's mutually assured destruction, but never mind. And the question is, will the US do that? I suspect they will, but I'd be interested to hear what other people's perspective is on that. Will the European Union do that? I have a great deal more doubt than that. But even that's post-bellum. We need to do it before the war. We need to make it absolutely clear as a deterrent now that this is going to happen. Will the US do that? Probably. Again, correct me. Will the EU do it? I very, very much doubt it, because foreign policy is qualified majority voting, and no matter what the issue is, we find that the usual suspects, Hungary, Greece, Portugal, etc., will water the whiskey down so that you can hardly taste the alcohol. Am I right? I do hope I'm wrong, but maybe Jean-Baptiste and Tereza can correct me.
Who's first? Tereza?
Yes, well, I think there's been a EU-China summit on 1st of April. It was a virtual one with Xi Jinping and von der Leyen and Charles Michel. And obviously the war in Ukraine was the key subject. And I think the two European leaders really hammered home the fact that, we are not just following the US, but that it's our war and that we are very serious about the sanctions, and that basically China shouldn't deliver any weapons to Ukraine and should, not try to circumvent the sanctions somehow differently. So it wasn't so much about Taiwan, it was about the current situation. But I think the message was quite clear to China that the sanctions are serious and would affect China as well. So, it doesn't answer your question, how to prevent the similar situation in Taiwan, but I think you tried hard to make this point. In terms of future defenses, I think he was working a lot on anti-coercive measures. So that's one way of defending the European market, and in terms of the question of asset freezes, I think that's also one thing which Europeans are also making clear, that the implementation differs country by country, but that's part of the targeted sanctions for sure, and that also was made clear to Xi. How that would play out in terms of Taiwan, that's a bit more of a question, but I think the principle was shown. So I think in that regard that would be sort of replicated. So that would be my view.
Yeah, I totally agree with you that economic and financial sanctions are a powerful deterrent to Xi, that we need to make it clear that there will be a very high and unacceptable cost, and we have only a couple of years to do that. I believe what we've been doing with Russia is indeed a quite relevant example for Xi, and it's quite clear, I think, in the mind of both the US, Europe, and probably other partners of sanctions, such as Japan and South Korea as well, Singapore as well, New Zealand and Australia, that they are directed not only at Russia, that's the primary target, but the secondary target is certainly China, in case they have bad ideas, one of them being to support Russia now, the other being to do the same thing than Russia in a couple of years. However, to be credible, we need to take those 5 to 10 years that we have to reduce our dependency on China. Because if we don't reduce our economic dependency on China, no threat of sanctions will be taken seriously, because that will be harming us as much as them. So we need really to to work seriously on that, to diversify, not to be in the position of some European countries in terms of their dependency on Russia for oil and gas. And here, of course, I'm referring to Germany, for example. We should make sure that we are not in that position in our relation with China in a couple of years. So we need to reduce as much as possible our dependency in all sectors. And then we will be credible when we will make such economic and financial threats.
Okay, I think Charles-Philippe has a few things to say on this.
Quickly. Two quick points to dear colleague. First point, the Washington Post this morning has a great analysis of how secondary sanctions would or might impact China if China were to collaborate more openly in providing weaponry to Russia. And I think from that article, I get the impression from that analysis that Xi Jinping is very careful and somewhat aghast by the length of that war, the inconclusiveness of that war, and Putin's strategy, because so far, however, all the promises of great help and great solidarity that they both, exposed to the world before the Olympics, China has not been 100%, behind Russia. It's been 50%, 70%, but not in the real world where it counts in terms of providing weaponry and so on. Jake Sullivan made clear to his Chinese counterpart that that would be a red line that should never, ever be crossed. So in my opinion, that gives you somewhat of an answer that they do fear sanctions. They really do fear sanctions. Second quick answer is, well, I beg to differ on this thing that decoupling should be a great strategy, not necessarily in the case of the United States. And it's been Trump's big mantra to say we should get rid of China. It's a bad player, bad apple, and we should not even trade with them. Well, you know what? If you're in the Chinese shoes, the American market is probably the biggest export market for China for all the products that they do produce at a far cheaper rate and with very fewer or less important wages compared to other countries. If they were to lose that American market, the biggest middle class in the whole world would suffer tremendously, because there would be clearly a job a problem. Unemployment would rise. She would be less popular. So in a very pervert way, I would say it may not be in an interest of the United States to depend on China, so fine with decoupling, but actually it's leverage. It's leverage. China needs the US as much as perhaps the US needs all those good products that cost nothing from China. They're like two scorpions in the bottle, except here we're not talking about nuclear strategy, we're talking about economic interdependence. And mind you, economic interdependence does not mean that we avoid wars. If that were so, the First World War would have never occurred and so on. But that being said, it's part of the cost analysis on the part of the regime in Beijing is, how far should we go? And are we willing and ready to lose the American market? That's the question. And also, I forgot, the enormous amounts of bonds invested by the Chinese in the American economy, which is also leverage for them, because if they were to withdraw those bonds, oh boy, we would suffer a huge financial crisis. But then on the other hand, it's good investment because for them, it means leeway, it means interest rates, it means somewhat growth and so on. So it works both ways. Sanctions and the coupling, I think, are two ways by which you can influence the mindset of Xi Jinping's, world.
Okay, thank you. We will now go online. There is James Lee, who was part of yesterday's first panel, who has a question. So can we put him on the screen so that we can see him?
Hi, can you all see me and hear me?
James, you can talk.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So my question is for Dr. Jeangène Vilmer. So my question is about France's policy on arms sales to Taiwan. I was under the impression that France had decided to end its arms sales to Taiwan in the 1990s, but I was surprised to read that at least the Taiwanese had requested the upgrade to the missile interference system of the Lafayette frigates. And first of all, my question on that specific case was, did France ultimately agree to that request by the Taiwanese? And this kind of the larger question is, does France now have a new kind of long-term policy on arms sales to Taiwan? Thank you.
Thank you, James. Jean-Baptiste?
Well, thank you for your question, but I'll be very quick answering this question or not answering this question because I don't have any information regarding potential arms sale to Taiwan. They may be asking and requesting. It does not mean that we will do it on the other hand. In terms of our policy, I can't answer that question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. John Blackson again. Charles-Philippe, thank you for your remarks. I was really struck by your final kind of question in your opening statement about whether it was in America's interests to defend Taiwan. And you mentioned also, and this is for the panel as well, the fact that politics are local and becoming increasingly local in the United States. The issues are local. And of course, one of the things that's of great concern about the prospect of war in Taiwan is the prospect of escalation to crossing the nuclear threshold. And we know that the Chinese, we talked about this yesterday, dramatically increased their nuclear capabilities, their second strike capability, their ability to genuinely present a threat back to the United States, to, present a potential existential threat. That does raise the question of mutually assured destruction. And so then, given all of that, and I know you only asked the question, but come on, what's the answer? What is the answer in your view?
Thank you.
How important is Taiwan to the United States?
Thank you, John.
Well, okay, if I were the leader. I believe Taiwan is important first and foremost because it is a democracy, dude. No, I mean, that's how you have to speak to American people. Hey, dudes, this is a democracy. If we start, we committed to defend Ukraine, and probably Ukraine will survive because we committed. And no, there's not been a nuclear war. That's interesting because 2 months ago, everybody was asking me, well, I don't want the Third World War. Even my sister called me almost, crying, saying, we can't have the Third World War. And I said, let's cool down. Let's cool down. Putin knows that this is the end of Russia as much as he would want the end of the United States. We invented nuclear weapons. We cannot disinvent them. And notwithstanding the fact that, Einstein said that we're risking nuclear catastrophe one day. So far, I beg or dare to say that we have probably saved the world more wars than created ones. So far, only one slip, and it's one too much. I agree, but we can't disinvent them, right? So I would commit for democracy first and foremost. And yes, it is in the national interest for another reason. Offshore balancing, I'm putting my realist hat here. I love that. Well, they have great notions. It's better than post-positivist, semantic, or whatever, theories. Offshore balancing means if you're losing Taiwan, what effect, answer me, does that have on South Korea and on Japan? I mean, to ask the question is to answer it. There would be, like Ukraine, say Biden had said, or Trump, actually, I have nothing to say about Ukraine. I don't even know where it is. Say he had said that. What would our friend from the Czech Republic, who's analyzing Germany this morning, would say about US commitment? What would Canada have said? Oops. I'm sure Trudeau would have said, oops. What do I say now? He said that, and Macron is calling all over the place, say, are you going to at least you commit? I think we see the scenario. If we were not to commit to Taiwan, I think we would lose seriously at both ends. Democracy and security. So I'm looking for a president, man or woman, who is going to commit for the national interest of the United States, whatever that means, and not the public opinion interest, to answer your question. I fear, like Jonathan, we're all in the same team on this, that comes 2024, we might not get the president we would like under the circumstances of you're talking about. I can be more apocalyptic if you want. I can go on and on.
All right, thank you very much. Other questions? There's Cleo in the back that has a question, so you can go, Cleo Pascal.
Thank you. Given that that China seems to be involved in full-scale political warfare, as Dr. Vilmer's amazing paper, everybody should read it, has already shown us, who is fighting back well? What can we learn from them? And what would you like your countries or areas to do to fight back on the political warfare front?
It's great that I'm just chairing this panel. Go ahead.
Well, I think there are many things we can learn from Taiwan. For example, I'll give you one concrete example. Their Minister for Digital Affairs, I'm not sure exactly the name of the ministry, Audrey Tang. She asked all the ministers to prepare counter disinformation materials, including under the form of memes that can be very easily and quickly spread on social networks, and therefore using humor, which is a very efficient way of responding to disinformation. Because if you're responding to disinformation with a 5-point fact-checking sheet, it's not working. So you need to be at the same level most of the time, and the use of humor, like in Europe, in Brussels, the East Stratcom Task Force can do as well on its Twitter account, EU vs Disinfo. They're doing that a bit. States, they are most of the time reluctant to use humor and memes to respond to disinformation, but I think it's quite efficient. So they've been preparing in Taiwan. They've been anticipating each ministry, for example, the Ministry of Agriculture, because there is a great deal of disinformation in Taiwan that is based on fake agricultural stories, for example, the price of pineapple or bananas or things like this. So they are anticipating what could be the next disinformation, and they are preparing material to respond to it. So they are quite good in that respect. However, I think the limit of the comparison is that it's such a specific case of a country sharing more or less the same language. When I say more or less, it's also because, you know, on the continental side, they are using sometimes, most of the time, I would say traditional Chinese in order to conduct disinformation in Taiwan and to be undetected, but they are making mistakes, and you can still see that they are coming from simplified Chinese. You know, it's the same space using more or less the same language, and it cannot be compared with, for example, the situation of Europe when it's being targeted by Russian disinformation or even Chinese disinformation. So there are limits in what we can learn about what's working or not, but I would say the work of Audrey Tang in her ministry has been great, and we can certainly learn more about what they've been doing. Yeah.
Yes, I think I would agree on fighting disinformation. I think in Europe it's been done quite well, though more on the Russian disinformation than the Chinese one in the Baltic countries as well. One of the outcomes of the German Indo-Pacific strategy, I think, was published in 2020. In 2021, it was like a progress report, and one of the sort of successes. Well, there were two successes mentioned. One was the floating of the frigate Bayern around Indo-Pacific, which is good, but at the same time it's a bit sad that it's just one frigate, right? But the other success was a German-Singaporean cooperation on disinformation, and a new center fighting disinformation based in Singapore. So sort of funded by German government. So I think that's a good one too. More broadly, in terms of Europe, I have more hope in terms of the EU level rather than individual countries. We've touched upon a little bit on the case of Lithuania, where it's been targeted by sort of Chinese embargo for allowing opening the Taiwan's office in the capital. And in the end, the response came from the European Commission, which basically made clear to the Chinese side that if China is targeting Lithuania as a small country within the EU, it's targeting the entire European single market. And the European Commission is bringing this case before the WTO. We know that WTO at the moment is not functioning as it should, but nevertheless, I think the signal is there that, you know, you can't just pick a small member state and think that you will get away with it. Basically, it means that you are targeting the EU as a whole, and obviously a single market, European single market is an important one for the Chinese. At the same time, I think sometimes what kind of helps is that the Chinese shoot themselves in the foot. So sometimes they, you know, overreact themselves. Quite clear example is the EU-China investment agreement, which was concluded at the end of 2020 under Germany's presidency of the EU. So Merkel and Germany was quite heavily involved. It was a bit controversial among other member states, but nevertheless, I actually think that from the economic trade perspective, it would be a good one also because it puts the EU at the same footing as the US is vis-a-vis China. But nevertheless, what then happened in, I think in March, EU targeted several individuals who were found responsible for the Xinjiang issue, and China reacted with tit-for-tat sanctions, but instead of, you know, again picking maybe one or two people in the EU, it basically sanctioned members of the European Parliament, the entire subcommittee of the European Parliament, another EU body, plus a big think tank in Berlin. So basically overreacted, over the top, and that meant that European Parliament, which has to approve the investment treaty, basically said, well, we are not even going to discuss it unless you lift all those sanctions. And so the agreement is in limbo. The Chinese want to go ahead with it. But again, everyone in the EU is making clear that unless you lift the sanctions, this is not going to happen. So in a way, sometimes the Chinese sort of, you know, make a disservice to themselves by not even, I would say, not even understanding how the EU works, and therefore, or you know, how countries in Europe work, and therefore sort of you know, doing something which otherwise could have been criticized for other reasons, but basically now it's not you know, it's not happening.
Okay, we have 3 minutes left. I think Justin has a question.
Well, first of all, thank you all for this great discussion. I really appreciate your presence and all of your insights. My question begins with what you said, Gaëlle, in your presentation, calling for Canada should develop more depth in its Canadian Armed Forces, which would be a paradigm shift, as you know, because we tend to have a sample army or one-punch army, as the Australians do. Or échantillonnage, we would say in French. My question for all of you, and because we see this in the war in Ukraine, the incapacity to sustain significantly military commitments or support to Ukrainians, limited artillery, limited capacities, the need in the US to develop a greater industrial capacity. If the future of war are long-term protracted conflict, how capable is France, Germany, the US, Canada to have that capacity of sustainable military commitments in high intensity warfare? Are they capable of developing those kind of forces that would be needed for a Sino-American war?
I can quickly start. The US, I think, has done just marvelous inroads in the last few weeks in answer to that question. I think if you think about it, believe me, in the Pentagon, they are thinking about it 24/7. How do you rebuild the industrial capacity to actually produce weaponry? One image that will answer your question, which I haven't seen in Canada, I don't know about France and I don't know about Germany, is the fact that the Pentagon has called for a meeting between the 5 or 6 most important military producer industrial companies, Northrop Grumman, whatever, Boeing, to Washington, and ask them, okay, like the Second World War, say, how much can you produce sidewinders? How much can you produce howitzers? How much can you do this and how much can you do that? And actually the response was absolutely fascinating. The heads of the companies were all for it. Of course, there's money to make, but in terms of switching quickly the production lines in order to increase the production of those weapons, reminded people of the fact that this is an adaptive strategy and they can be good at it actually. And especially with the Lend-Lease program that's been voted actually in Congress, the money is there. So, I mean, you can't have it all. I mean, if you want weapons, you have to pay. So of course, they're gonna make money with it. So if you don't want them to make money in the first place, well, then don't get into that business. So if the goal is to help Ukraine, actually, I'm quite optimistic that in the coming weeks, and we see the evidence of that. Every day, there are about 8 American planes that bring to Ukraine lots of weaponry, lots of them, and lots of military equipment, from goggles to infrared equipment, to the howitzers, to the javelins, of course, and so on. So much so that it's actually depleting the army's stockpile. So this is why they're asking the industries to actually come up to bat and increase their production. So my answer to your question is, to quote them, we're working on it, and we're working on it quite efficiently. So I think I'm more concerned, Justin, I'll end on this, on the political side, the willingness to fight it off until whatever. That I'm more concerned with than the industrial production or the military production. Biden said, I'm committed. Comes fall, I'll still be committed. Well, that's one thing to say, and the other is, of course, all the troops, the political troops following. I'm not sure. We'll see. The political answer, uncertain.
Well, maybe a little bit on the German side of things. I mean, in terms of providing military equipment now and in sort of near future, that's definitely the tricky bit. I mean, German government has promised things like tanks, howitzers, and so on. Then it discovered that it actually doesn't have them. So then asked the Rheinmetall, one of the companies, to kind of well, not produce it, but to allow its stocks to be sent. Then there was a bit of a reluctance whether to do it or not. And in the end, some of the steps which are done is called Ringtausch, so sort of countries like the Czech Republic, which still has sort of the Cold War weapons, sends it to Ukraine and then would get replacement from Germany or from the United States. But it's not working very well at the moment. In terms of a bit longer term prospects, Olaf Scholz promised to invest 100 billion in upgrading Bundeswehr's equipment. So that's a good thing, but it's going to take time. And also, I think what Jean-Baptiste was saying before, I think what I would also focus in the future terms, it's to really make most out of the European options, so that not so that we don't have 20 6 types of tanks and planes and whatnot, but that we actually, combine forces and produce them. That would, of course, strengthen the EU also as a global actor, or as the French like to say, the strategic autonomy of the EU. So that would be my answer, but that's going to take time.
Well, we talk of strategic sovereignty now, but we can talk about both. But I think you're right, Justin. It's a very good point. There's been a big public debate actually in France on high intensity warfare and the implications of high intensity warfare on the French military and the size of the French military and our sustainability, our ability to last in such a conflict. And it did not start with Ukraine. It started with Nagorno-Karabakh. Right after the Nagorno-Karabakh war in 2020, started the public debate, including within the parliament, on this issue. What should be the consequences and all that. So, and in particular, it's no secret that we're lacking munitions. We don't have enough munitions to last in such a situation. However, when you're a nuclear power, or when you're a state protected by nuclear deterrence, you may be tempted not to spend too much to increase your conventional capabilities, because theoretically it should not make any difference because you're protected by nuclear deterrence. So you're not supposed to be attacked by a conventional power because you're protected by nuclear deterrence. However, Ukraine shows that we may need to develop those industrial lines and capabilities, maybe not for ourselves, but for others. So that maybe is the game changer in the way we think. We need certainly to muscle up and build up our own capacities for ourselves, even though if we are in a peer-to-peer high-intensity war, well, nuclear deterrence should play its role. But in a situation like Ukraine and maybe tomorrow Taiwan, even though it will probably be different, but in other kind of situations like this where we have to help a third-party state, then we need to take that into account as well in our plans to resize our military and our industrial capability. So yes, I think it's definitely an important topic, and it's been part of public debate.
Just very quickly, in the case of Canada, I think beyond the debate of how much capability, what type of capabilities we need, even if we were to double, for example, the number of surface combatant that we would acquire in the next 10 years, I think the core problem is actually how are we going to man those platforms? And so it's one thing to acquire a lot of kit, to have a lot of platform, to have all these great conventional capabilities. But if we cannot use them because we don't have the personnel to actually operate them, but also train, maintain, and everything, I'm not sure how we're supposed to do this. So I think to a certain extent, yes, we need to modernize our military, but I think one of the options is also to look at different, and what can Canada bring to the table in a joint operation and or in a coalition. And we may need to start looking at the new domains where less personnel is required, but then we have the level of technology required to provide those effects. So that might be a way to actually contribute. But those are conversations we need to have and as a country, and that are going to be actually very difficult to address, especially when we talk about personnel.
All right. Well, thank you to all of you. Please join me to thank and to congratulate our great panelists this morning. Thank you very much.